You know, there's a word that we Christians throw around a lot. I love what it means, but I don't tend to use it a whole lot, simply because it's a word we use so rarely these days in normal conversation that I fear most aren't clear on what that word means. I love this word, but I don't use it very often because I'm worried it confuses people or throws people off. I'm talking about the word grace. I think most people today, when they hear the word grace, they think of gracefulness. They think of the smooth and controlled movements of a dancer. But no, most of the time when we Christians use the word grace, we don't mean that. What we mean is the definition that Merriam-Webster says is that word's archaic definition, a definition that's old-fashioned and no longer in regular use. No, when we use the word grace, we use it as something of a synonym for the words mercy or compassion. And usually we use the word grace to describe compassion and mercy that's been shown to someone who has caused some sort of offense, someone who has done something wrong or harmful. Grace is giving someone who has failed in some way the room to be human. Grace might still ask someone to take responsibility for his or her actions and the consequences of those actions, but grace ultimately seeks that person's good and well-being. In Christian circles, we most often talk about God's grace. We talk about how God has made it possible for us to be forgiven for our moral failures. What's more, He continues to provide for our needs, and He empowers us to overcome the temptation to do wrong. The very one who is most offended by our wrongdoing, our Creator, is the one who rescues us from the eternal consequences of our offenses and helps us learn to do better. That is God's grace. But that sort of grace can be shown by human beings as well, especially by those who have experienced God's grace. In fact, Jesus commanded us to show such grace when He commanded us to love our enemies. That grace has been shown in some extraordinary ways throughout history. I'm sure many of you have heard of Corrie ten Boom. Ten Boom was a watchmaker in the Netherlands during World War II. She and her family were part of the resistance. She and her family sheltered Jews from the Nazis. Now, her family was eventually caught, and Ten Boom and her sister ended up eventually in the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Ten Boom was released because of a clerical error only days before all the women in her age group in the camp were gassed. When the war was over, Ten Boom went back to Germany and met two of the guards from the camp, one of whom had been particularly cruel to her sister. It would be some time before she could forgive them, but God enabled her to show grace to that guard with a friendly handshake. In 1981, Pope John Paul II was seriously injured in an assassination attempt by Mehmet Ali Akka. 2 years later, he would meet his would-be assassin in prison. He told him he was forgiven, and he called him his brother. In 1994, during the genocide of the Tutsi tribe in Rwanda, Immaculée Ilibagiza lost her entire family. And yet years later, she personally extended forgiveness to one of the men who murdered her loved ones. In 2006, a man named Charles Roberts killed 3 Amish girls and mortally wounded 2 others before killing himself. The girls' Amish community, including their own family members, visited Roberts' wife to console and to comfort her. What's more, they offered to help her out financially in the wake of her husband's death. All are remarkable examples of grace shown by the people of God. There's one thing that all 4 of those people, or groups of people in the case of the Amish folks, have in common, is that they are all Christians. We're in a series right now about Joseph, the earthly stepfather of Jesus. The Gospel of Matthew starts with a genealogy, a record of many of Joseph's ancestors. And it shows that Joseph came from a long line of people who had been shown God's grace. Abraham and David are mentioned twice. Not only are these men two of the greatest heroes of the Old Testament, but Jews of that time also believed that the Messiah, God's chosen king, would be descended from these two men. But even more importantly for our purposes, they had been shown incredible grace by God. God had blessed Abraham with a son, too, really, when he was around a century old. God had empowered David to be a great and successful warrior, despite the fact that he was not particularly impressive physically. And he didn't make good choices when it came to women either. More on that in a moment. But even more notable in this genealogy of Joseph is the mention of 4 women. Now, it wasn't unheard of to mention women in a genealogy back then, but neither was it typical. First of all, there's Tamar. I have in my notes to share a little bit about her story, but as we have more kids in the room than usual, I think I'll skip that part. Then there's Rahab, a Canaanite woman who helped Israelite spies infiltrate the city of Jericho. She and her family, though foreigners, would later be welcome among the people of Israel. There's Ruth, yet another Canaanite woman who was also welcomed into the people of God and was shown compassion by a relative of her late husband. She would ultimately become the great-grandmother to King David. And then there's Bathsheba, who isn't even mentioned by name in the passage. King David had an affair with her when she was married to another man. And when she got pregnant, David proceeded to have her husband killed on the battlefield so he could marry her himself. Now, the first child died, but her second child, Solomon, would become the heir to David's line. So all of these women would be the ancestors of the Messiah, a woman who, shall we say, posed as a, you'll have to look her up yourself. 2 foreigners and a woman who became pregnant by a man other than her husband. And yet they would all 4 play a part in God's redemption of the world by being the ancestors of the Messiah himself. That is God's grace. And Joseph himself was a descendant of this line. He likely knew his heritage. He knew the grace that had been shown to his ancestors. And then the day came when he would be called upon to demonstrate grace himself. He was engaged to a young woman named Mary. Their marriage had likely been arranged since they were children, and soon after Mary became able to bear children, both of their families would have prepared a formal contract. Joseph's family would have paid a sum of money to Mary's family. Mary's family would have paid a sum of money to Joseph's family. This money was a sort of insurance policy should either party prove unfaithful to the contract. If either party had a dalliance with someone else or just ended the engagement, the other party would keep the money. All of it. Then one day Mary shows up and tells Joseph that she's pregnant, and he knows the baby isn't his. She claims that an angel told her this would happen and that the baby was conceived supernaturally by the power of God's Holy Spirit. But let's be honest, who would believe that story? Joseph sure didn't. Try to imagine what Joseph's reaction might have been, what he might have been feeling. He would have felt betrayed, angry, hurt. Most men would have been out for blood, wanting someone else to pay for their pain. But here's how Joseph reacted to what he thought was his future wife's infidelity. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law, and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. There's a lot that's communicated in that one single sentence. Mary would have been considered an adulteress, a capital offense according to the Old Testament law, punishable by stoning. Now, Jews under Roman rule didn't typically carry out that punishment, but there was a high price to pay nonetheless. First of all, Mary's family would have to pay back the money that Joseph's family paid as part of the arrangement. Joseph's family, on the other hand, would keep the money that Mary's family had paid. Furthermore, few men would be willing to marry a known adulteress, and a woman's survival back then depended on being married. That Joseph was faithful to the law likely means he had a strong belief that adultery was wrong, a sin in God's eyes. He couldn't see himself being married to a woman who didn't take God's law seriously, but at the same time, he did not want to expose her to a public disgrace and had in mind to divorce her quietly. Joseph planned to release Mary from the terms of the contract, to call off the engagement. Publicly, it would look like Joseph was the one who was responsible for her pregnancy before they were officially married, and then he had second thoughts about the marriage. Consequently, he would bear the public blame for breaking the contract. Then it would be his family who would forfeit their financial contribution to the arrangement. But Joseph was willing to pay the price, both financially and in terms of his reputation, even though he was the offended party, to keep Mary from ruin. That's grace. That's unfailing love. Now, the primary point I'm trying to make is that human beings, when empowered by God, are capable of tremendous demonstrations of healing, life-giving grace. But it does begin with knowing God's grace personally. It begins with recognizing the grace that you have been shown by God. Joseph could look back through the generations at his ancestors who had been shown God's grace, so he could demonstrate that grace to someone whom he believed had wronged him. And in order to demonstrate grace in our own relationships and circumstances, we need to recognize the grace that we've been shown. When I look at Joseph's situation, I see a man who's been wronged taking upon himself the cost of the wrongdoing for the sake of the offender. Now, who does that sound like? That's exactly what Jesus did for you and me. The cost of everything that you and I have done wrong fell to the very person who was wronged, our Creator. Understand that every wrong you've ever committed against a human being, including yourself, is an offense against the one whose image they bear. It is his right and responsibility to ensure that justice is served, and he did so by covering the cost himself. And Jesus doesn't stop there. Imagine if a cuckolded husband decided to take his wife in regardless of her indiscretion. He chose to love her, care for her, and patiently help her learn to be faithful. That's what Jesus does for us as well as for everyone who has wronged us. We're all human. We're all works in progress. None of us has it all right, and none of us are totally free from weakness or temptation or misunderstanding. God shows us grace, and He's perfect. How then can we imperfect people not show grace to each other? Do we not want grace shown to us? Last week I suggested that Jesus, though the Son of God, still needed to learn because in His time on earth He faced a number of the limitations that come with being human. I suggested that because He probably spent a lot of His time apprenticed to Joseph, He likely learned a lot more from His adoptive father than carpentry. I imagine that Joseph shared this story of how he found out about Mary's pregnancy with Jesus. Or maybe it was Mary who shared the story with him. Either way, Jesus once again saw a fine example of godliness in the man to whom his true Father in heaven had entrusted him. May we too see in Joseph an example of how God's grace can work through regular human displays of love, mercy, and compassion. May we see in this example what it truly means to love one's enemies, to pray for those who wish us harm. May we learn from God's example how to show grace to others.